All right, Joel Gausten here from joelgausten.com. One of my greatest joys in being a musician is having the opportunity to share stages and moments with remarkable people. And my guest for this conversation is a clear example of that. I am beyond delighted and just so excited to reconnect with my guest from Minnesota, lovely
Yep.
Minnesota, the lovely Gaelynn Lea. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on your series. This is cool.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. I've wanted to reconnect for a bit. I was thinking the last time you and I saw each other in person, it must have been what, 2018?
I think so. Like about it. Yeah, yeah. That sounds about right, actually. Which is a
Yeah.
long time ago now, which is surprising.
Yeah, and we regrettably didn't connect during that last Pigface tour in 2019 because we ended up doing different legs of it at that time. So
Yeah.
it's nice to reconnect and glad to see you're doing well and staying active with things. And we have a lot of history to go through and a lot of things to update people on who know you and are familiar with your work.
Mhm.
But I wanted to check in with you first because yesterday was actually the fourth anniversary of the COVID lockdown. And
Oh.
when that happened and I started to see back in March of 2020 all the announcements about shows being canceled and tours being postponed, you and your husband Paul were the first people I thought of because I know you were a very consistently active live performer. You just toured all the time, probably more than anybody else I've ever known. So first and foremost, how have the last few years been for you in that respect, and how did that sort of absence of live performance impact you? Because I know you were such a an active touring person for years until that happened.
Yeah, yeah. It was a surreal time. It's funny to think about it being 4 years ago, almost exactly now. We were actually driving to a tour in Colorado when we had our masks and our hand sanitizer, and we were all prepared to try to do these shows. And then I called a friend who is a doctor, and I said, "Is it irresponsible of me to do this? Like, I feel a little weird about it." And she's like, "Yeah, you shouldn't make people choose to go put themselves in danger to do a show." So I canceled all my shows, I think, on the 12th, and then the 13th is when the rest of the world shut down. And it's been an interesting ride. I mean, like, um, I started literally the next week. So on the 20th was my very first live stream show on YouTube, and I kept that going weekly for a year and a half. I mean, like, long after most people stopped doing it, I was still going. And I actually do them. Like, I'm gonna do one in May and another one in June, just because I have a little crowd that's been at all of them basically since then. And so that kept me going for the first year and a half for sure. Like, getting to connect. One of the ways that I had Martin on a show once from Pigface. I had different artists I had met on the road, like, be guests on the show. I should have you sometime, actually. But we we would talk, and it kind of kept me connected to the music world, and I would perform. And there's something, although it doesn't replace, it's not like an equivalent for live performance. Something really special happened where people from all over the world would be in the same space, chatting with each other in the YouTube live chat, and asking me questions. And it felt like a very communal thing that I think kind of got underplayed. Like, I don't know if people recognized how beautiful that was in some ways. So although I don't want to just do that from now on, I'd like knowing that that's a way to connect with people from different locations across the world. Because how often do I get to England, and yet half the people on my live streams are from England. And um, so that was that. And then life was kind of trucking along. I had this idea of writing a memoir, so I was like, oh, what a great time now I should start it. So in 2021, I was gonna, like, the end of 2021, I was getting ready to do, like, really start writing. And then I got an offer to compose the music for Macbeth on Broadway. So, which was totally out of the blue. not something I had planned to ever do in my whole life. And we went out to New York for it. You know, Paul and I'm high risk for COVID complications. And not only that, like as a disability community member, like I'm sure you've experienced this, but in the medical world, things can go wrong if doctors don't understand really a lot about you. So just get avoiding COVID in general was like my plan. And so we were very careful, but we still managed to do really cool things. Like we went out to New York and put all this music in that I had recorded ahead of time, and had it like queued up live. So it wasn't live, it was queued up, but it felt live. It was triggered at exact moments in the script. And it was really fun to try a whole new kind of way of presenting music to have it be background on a stage. I still haven't released the soundtrack to that yet, but it's in my plan for the next year and a half. And then after that, then I started really writing. I got an agent, which was amazing. Kind of she emailed me off of my website and said, "It says you're writing a book. Do you have an agent yet?" And I was like, "No, I wasn't planning to get one, but I was really excited to be able to, because she got me an actual publisher that's national, like Algonquin, and now I'm writing and I'm actually working on a musical that hasn't been announced yet. So I'm going to write the songs for a musical, and that's pretty cool. So it's these big projects that are different than touring. And in some ways, I think eventually when my book comes out, I'd like to do a book tour and slash music tour again. But I also feel grateful that I was able to explore some new creative avenues in this last few years and like kind of stretch myself a little bit. I think eventually the long term goal is it would be great to do shows at least some of the time. Although I must admit, by 2020, when we were heading out, it was like a double edged sword. On one hand, I finally felt like I knew what I was doing, and the shows were starting to be better attended, and I kind of felt like I had a system in place, but I was getting a little bit burned out. I mean, we did it a lot, 9 months a year for 3.5 years. And so I was thinking, like, I want to do this, but maybe not so continually, take bigger breaks in between and do something else, or or write or whatever. And I think when I go back to touring, it probably will not be that 9 month a year model that we did for so long, because it's really fun. I mean, really fun, but it is really really intense, and you don't get to be around your family much or be home for anything. And and there were downsides with the positives, but I don't think I'd want to recreate it exactly like that. That's a
Yeah.
very long answer. Sorry.
No,
4 hour podcast.
you share some really cool things in that answer about the book and the musical, and I'm just overall just thrilled that you're doing well after, the last few years, and you're
Yeah,
still active, which I knew you would be because I know how you are.
yeah,
So it's really cool. There are things in the works. I'm really excited for you. Um, to introduce viewers who may not be familiar with you, but hopefully will be a lot more familiar by the end of this conversation. I wanted to get into your history as a musician.
yeah.
Um, as I mentioned earlier, you're based in Minnesota. Are you from Minnesota originally?
Yep, from Duluth, where I live now. I went to college in the Twin Cities, but I moved back to Duluth in like 2007 or something like that, 2006.
And when and how did music really take hold for you and become such a big part of your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was a journey. My parents are really musical. They ran a dinner theater actually, starting from the age of 10, and they mostly did music, like small musicals and stuff. And they were in a lot of musicals, and I was in a lot of plays, and music was a big part. But then in fifth grade, I joined orchestra, and that's when I really got interested in making music, like hands on. I was very into orchestra all the way through high school, and but by the time I got to college, I knew I didn't really want to major in music. I wanted to major in well, I ended up majoring in poli sci, and so I ended up kind of getting into fiddle music, Celtic fiddle music, and I played that for many years. And that's pretty much all I did is like go to jam sessions and play, and it was like a hobby or like an outlet, just a fun thing that I did. And then in 2008, I met a person named Andy Gable. He's a banjo guitarist who was living in Duluth at the time, and we really had fun jamming together at these jam sessions. And he's like, "We should form a band," so we did, and that's when I first got into performing on stage, like not as a part of a larger ensemble. And I was hooked. Like I really liked it, but I was always backup fiddle or harmonies and never in the center, which was fine. I was completely fine with that. But then in 2011, I met Alan Sparhawk from the band Low. He happens to also hail from Duluth, and he asked if I would do an experimental film score thing, live score with him. So we worked on that together, and he introduced me to the looping pedal, which is an electronic device that kind of layers up your violin. And at first, he was the one that would loop it, and I would just play harmonies and improvise to what I heard. But eventually, he brought me a pedal and said, "You should figure out how to do this because eventually you can loop by yourself." And I didn't think that was realistic, but it turns out he was right, and I really loved it. And kind of that's when I started writing songs. And so I didn't even do music full time at that point. At that point, it was still like my main hobby. Um, but the next year, 2012 ish, a friend from elementary school passed away. He had cancer. And I remember thinking, man, if I had a year left, what would I want to be doing with my life? And I knew that I wanted it to involve music, but I didn't like consider touring or performing as a way to sustain myself. So I actually started teaching fiddle lessons, and I
Hmm.
taught fiddle for 3 years in Duluth, right up until I won the Tiny Desk. Like that's the reason I stopped teaching. I really liked it. Actually, I had about 15 students, ages 6 to 65. So everybody was different, and they were all pretty much in the beginning to intermediate stages because I do play pretty differently than they did. So I didn't want to pretend to help them get into Juilliard with technique because our techniques were not exactly the same. But I understood music enough to translate it and to help encourage them along their paths. And so, and then the Tiny Desk is when I really was like, oh, maybe this is something I could do. Um, traveling and playing shows. It was a grand experiment, which really focused. I mean, Martin Atkins from Pigface was a big part of our planning process. So he played a big role in getting ready to leave and doing all this stuff to get ready to go. So yeah, that was a wild ride that
So,
year, 2016.
yeah, 2016, I was going to say that was Tiny Desk. Um, didn't you meet Martin at a conference somewhere? Isn't that how the two of you first connected, or was it some other way?
The very first time we met was actually in Chicago for the Tiny Desk contest prize. Like there were four shows around the country, and one of them was in Chicago. And they invited Martin to be on a panel because Bob Boylan was actually promoting his book at the same time, kind of like as part of this contest. So he would have guests talk about the songs that changed their lives, and he had Martin on. And so I got to listen to Martin talk. He's hilarious, as you know, and like insightful. And then I performed because that was part of the prize. It's like then I would do a show, and they were pretty big shows by my standards. I mean, even now, but I mean, especially then, they were like pretty packed. And kind of chatted with Martin after, and he gave me his card and said, "Here," uh, and then gave me his book too. And he said, "Read my book, and here you go." And he gave me the big one, like the Tour Smart one, and I remember being like, okay, cool. So I read his whole book cover to cover because I knew at this point, I knew that I think we were going to start to tour. Like Paul and I actually talked in April, so about a month afterwards, and said, okay, if we're going to do this, we have to do it together because I can't travel by myself because of my disability. And I didn't really want to try to organize like a stranger to come with me for all those things. And so um, we were like, okay, we're going to do it together. So then he got a leave of absence from his job, and we decided to sell our house and get a van. And I read his book, and I knew all this. Like I'm reading his book, gleaning as much insight as possible on how to book a tour and how to like do merch and all the stuff that his book covers. And I remember calling him and being like, "Yeah, we're selling our house." about a band, and he's like, "Isn't that a little extreme?" And I was like, "Well, it's already closing next week." So like he was like, "What the heck?" And so, but his book really helped because I think we would have made a lot more mistakes. It's not like we didn't make mistakes on the road, but I feel like I had kind of an idea of what we were getting ourselves into, just a little bit because I had known him, and then when it became clear that we were doing it, whether or not he thought it was a good idea, he managed to like sit down with me on the phone and like look at budget spreadsheets and talk about how are we going to make this work. And so he was really influential. I appreciated that a lot because you don't have mentors a lot of times in this industry. I mean, you're kind of like an entrepreneur, but you're making it up as you go along. And like, he is great for giving us so much guidance at the beginning.
Absolutely. And of course, Martin brought you into Pigface in 2016 for the 25th
Yep.
anniversary show at the House of Blues. And that's how you and I first met.
Yep.
Um, and people ask me about Pigface and they say, what was your favorite memory of Pigface? And not sure if I've ever told you this, but my favorite memory of Pigface has nothing to do at all with me being on stage or me being on the last record or anything like that. My favorite memory of Pigface was the afternoon at the House of Blues, about 4:30 in the afternoon. I arrive with Shannon, my wife at the time, who you know, and a friend of ours. We flew in from Boston, flew out from Boston. We arrive and you're sound checking, so the House of Blues is empty. You know, there was maybe a dozen people there out on the floor. I remember Jolly Roger being one of them, maybe Jeff Scheel, the three of us, Michelle Siebold, maybe a couple others, not many
Hmm.
people. Greta Brinkman, I think, was there. And that was kind of it. And you're sound checking the song Point Blank, which Chris Connolly sang on the first Pigface album, and your arrangement was totally different. But you're sound checking on that stage, and because the hall was empty at that point, it really had a very powerful, evocative sound. And I think everyone in that room stood there with tears in their eyes because it was such a gorgeous arrangement. And I'm thinking, I met Martin in '93. And that
Oh.
meeting in New Orleans, of all places, that meeting led to that happening as a member of Pigface. So when people ask you what was my favorite memory, it was standing watching you sound check at the House of Blues.
Oh, that's so
Absolutely.
cool. No, you never have told me that. That's awesome. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just remember feeling so. It was such a fun, especially that. I mean, actually, every time I see Pigface, I love it. But like, that was such a cool event, and it was so outside of my normal realm of music. Like, I'm a folky artist through and through, very Simon and Garfunkel style, and so like, I obviously wanted to say yes, and so I did. And then I'm learning Point Blank, which was really fun because it really could be looped, and it lent itself to that arrangement. But it also, if you hear the original, it was like, are people gonna like, what the heck are they gonna think of this weirdly done different arrangement? And I was so nervous. And then I got there, and everyone was just so nice. Like, they're all wearing black, and they got all their black makeup and their like spikes and everything, and their red contact lenses, and like everything looks really intense. But then they were just like the nicest people. So I just got a lot out of that experience every time I've encountered Pigface. I think my favorite individual memory, just because it was so like, it like kind of reinforced that idea that music lovers are just music lovers, like all on the inside. We're all just like squishy teddy bears. So I got off stage at Talia Hall many years later, and I'm getting down on the stage lift, and I had to walk through the crowd to get out of the room. Like, the Talia Hall was maybe 5 years later, I think, probably. When was that? Maybe a couple years later,
That was
2 3 years.
2019. So about roughly three
Yeah,
years from that first
yeah,
show.
3 years later. So I'm getting down, and I'm going through the crowd, and this guy with like a million, black leather, spiky dog collar, everything, and he had the contact lenses where his eyes were red. But he came up to me, and he's like, that was just so touching, and he was so sincere, and I was like, "I'm so glad that I had this experience," and just I think we other different kinds of music fans sometimes, I mean, subconsciously or consciously, you, like, see yourself as in a lane, and that's who you are, but really, there's no point to any of that, like, really, and I don't know, it's just it introduced me to a different world, and just being able to watch people have so much fun on
Mm.
stage. The encores or like the end of the show when everybody would come out and dance. It was just like it was such a party. I don't know. It was just really fun. Ah, Pigface. Yeah, that was great. I'm glad that I got to be a little part of that experience.
Yeah, and we're glad you were part of it as well. Believe me, it was so
Yeah,
much fun. And you did a studio recording of your arrangement of Point Blank at Martin's studio around that.
yeah,
Well, I
yeah.
think
It was
that
on a little 7 inch. I wish. I don't know if it's available digitally anywhere. I wish it was. I should ask him about putting it up digitally sometime because yeah, it was neat to be able to record it. Many, I think that was around 2019 as well
mm.
that we recorded it.
As far as your own music, when I tell friends about you and they ask me for a starting point, I love everything I've heard that you've done. Yeah, I'm such a fan, and I
Oh,
love your work immensely. But there tends to be one song that I tend to turn to because I think it represents a lot of the soul of who you are as a musician, and it's just a beautiful song, of course. Um, I'm talking about "Someday We'll Linger in the Sun." Um, and so I would recommend anybody who hasn't heard Galen's music check that song out as soon as you're done with this, or pause it and go listen and come back. All that said, I wanted to ask you a bit about that song because I think in many
yeah,
ways that is kind of the song that I don't want to say necessarily put you on the map, but got you some exposure that sort of opens the door to what you're doing now. So, what inspired that song in particular? How did you come up with the theme of that number?
yeah, that's interesting. That song I wrote it. It must have been early 2014, like, and I wrote it because I remember that because I wrote it after I ended up having to have an emergency hysterectomy, not to be too TMI, whatever that's called. But like I ended up having to have an emergency surgery about 6 months before my husband and I got married. It was not great timing. And in after the surgery, I ended up getting an infection and I ended up being in the hospital and it was getting kind of scary. Like, I mean, I don't know if I was ever really in danger. I've been closer to death before, we should say, but like, but it was not a good. I was starting to get nervous, but like, were they going to be able to get me back to normal? And would I be able to get married? You know, like it was pretty close. Yeah, it was pretty close call. So, the thing that that song is about is, you know, Paul was there with me. That was the first time I should say that I had a medical issue with Paul in my life, really, like a serious one. You know, before then, it's always, I mean, you know, growing up with a disability, like I would always have my parents be the people who intervened or were kind of there whenever anything went wrong. And so this was sort of our foray into that. And he was really great. He like sat with me and slept in the chair next to my bed and they let him stay. They were going to have him go home. And I was like, absolutely not. Like, we weren't technically married yet, but I was like, he can't leave. I'm not letting you take him. So then he stayed with me and just like it just made it a lot less scary. We actually celebrated our 7th date anniversary in the hospital. So it was a pretty like intense time. And so, anyway, so then a few months later, I wrote that song in my mind about that time. In particular, the verse about walking the pier and back again. It was the most scared I've ever been. That's what I'm talking about in that song. So it was a, you know, it's more generally about how love is beautiful even during the difficult times, but there was a specific impetus. The opening line about, you know, wine, rotted leaves and lemon rind. That was because we had watched a documentary by a sommelier about all the different ways to talk about wine, and I just thought it was so interesting that, you know, we all value, or not all, but a lot of people value wine and think of it as like a great luxurious kind of thing for your palate, but the ways we describe it is often with like gross words like rotting leaves and lemon rind or like cat pee. There's some weird ways that people talk about the taste of wine, and it kind of makes you think about how love is sort of like that. Like it's beautiful, but there are it's beautiful partly because it's complex, you know what I mean? So it's not always easy or good right away or in the moment. So yeah, that's what that song is about. Yeah, so that was an intense song. I remember getting the first line in my head and then it just rattles around in there for like weeks and kind of gradually built itself into a song. So that was a I remember that pretty distinctly.
Yeah, yeah, and the song still hits me even now. I was listening to it today, knowing that we would be talking, and yeah.
Ah, thanks.
Thank you for putting that into words, you know. And you put a lot of very important things into words. One thing I admire so much about you is your willingness to be so pure and honest in describing your life and describing your experiences. And for me, as someone with a disability myself, one of the things I respect most about you is what you offered during your TEDx talk on
Oh,
disability and sexuality. When I watched it for the first time, I thought, finally, somebody is saying these things. Um, there are still a lot of blind spots, I think, when it comes to um, society's view of folks with disabilities. Um, and you spoke so purely, and you make the point about living authentically, which I think is such a strong point to make. Um, so I'll certainly link that in the video description when I post this interview.
yeah.
People can check that out. And I believe there's a second TEDx talk as well that you did that I'll put in there as well. But specifically for the disability and sexuality, um, what made you decide to hit that topic, not only discuss it, but discuss it in a format like a TEDx talk and really just kind of go for it the way you did, which I think was fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, I was asked to do the TED Talk, and I was like, "What would it be about?" And the theme of that year's event was mind the gap. So like the gap, and that talk was born out of a paper that I wrote in college. That was probably my like if I had to be like, I'm glad I went to college. It was for that paper because I wasn't always like the best student. I procrastinated like you would not believe. But anyways, so I remember kind of I was reading this book about how sexuality had been usurped by capitalism. It was a political theory book by a theorist named Marcuse, and it's very like heady, like dry kind of. I mean, it wasn't like vibrant to the disability experience at all. It wasn't even about disability, but I remember not relating to it and being like, why am I not relating to this? Like, I guess I can see how sexuality has usurped capitalism, but I feel like none of the capitalism is directed at me. Like nobody's trying to sell me anything. Nobody's trying to. They just assume that you're asexual or that you're not a big enough demographic to advertise to or whatever it was. I just felt like not even included in the dialogue about like beauty standards, and because that's a lot of what the book was about is like they create a need by saying if you lose 10 pounds you'll be beautiful, so buy this product. That's kind of the argument he was making, and I was like, well, nobody is asking me to lose 10 pounds. And it was interesting because in some ways you grow up resenting that a little bit, like why is it so blatantly obvious that people with disabilities are excluded from beauty standards. But then on the other hand, and this is the epiphany that I had, is like it gave me a lot of freedom to just kind of like not care. Like I don't spend a lot, like I always feel kind of sad reading. There's a lot of memoirs I've read about women who really have struggled with beauty issues, like feeling beautiful enough and like thin enough, and it's real. Like I'm not trying to say there are issues haven't been real, but I just felt like I felt very liberated when I recognized that that wasn't actually a big part of my consciousness. And it's not because I'm so great, it's that nobody was pressuring me to feel that way. And then you recognize that, like, oh, people with disabilities aren't the only people that can choose, if they want to recognize that capitalism is deeply embedded in our view of beauty and sexuality. And we can all just reject that notion, because I do think life does become a little more, you have a little more freedom to be yourself in a world where you're not trying to fit in the stereotypical version of beauty, and it can be really liberating. And so although I think, as I've discovered with many other things about disability, disability makes those things more obvious to me, because I am on the outside looking in sometimes, or I am experiencing, you know, the need for help, for example, in a more direct way than a lot of people my age. But all of the truth of any epiphany you have about disability really does apply to everybody. Like, everybody can say, I want to just be myself, and I'm not going to worry about beauty standards or try to fit in or spend a lot of my energy on that. We can all do that. And so that's what that talk was about. But I think it bled into other areas of my life, just like recognizing that most of society's standards are not there for your own good. They're there for, capitalist reasons, or keeping the power structure in place, or whatever it is. So you don't have to feel like you have to fit in as much as I think society wants you to believe. I mean, I do believe in the universal truths of, like, that love is always better than hate. I really do have, like, one foundational level of, like, this is actually something that we should strive for. But beyond that, there's a million ways to be a person. You know what I mean? So, if that makes any sense.
Oh yeah, it makes absolute sense. There is a question I wanted to ask you. I've been meaning to have this conversation with you for a while because um, in early 2022, I got a job as a social worker, which I'd never done before, and I did that for about 14 months. And part of that work was working with a lot of folks with disabilities. And I didn't realize until I was doing that work, um, I didn't realize something that really kind of surprised me. It seems within the world of, we'll just call it care for folks with disabilities, the greater umbrella of providing care, there seems to be a disconnect between physical disability and mental health, how the physical disability impacts one's mental health. I know when I was going through physical therapy and receiving various care in the late 70s to mid 80s, um, nobody ever looked me in the eyes and went, "Are you all right in there? Like, are you handling this okay?" All I know is I had a lot of hands on me. You know, I felt vulnerable for the first 10 years of my life. You're kind of treated like, uh, unintentionally, of course, but it's kind of like you're more of a project than a person, if that makes sense, because people are poking and prodding you. And in my case, I think that's why I ended up covering my body with tattoos and getting into punk rock. It was like, let's bring the autonomy back. Let me have some sort of autonomy for my own body. But nobody ever checked in. And sadly, I still think people aren't checking in enough with folks with disabilities. So I wanted to share that and see what your perspectives on that thought may be.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's a huge issue. Where to begin? I mean, I guess I just feel that I think you're right. Like, I have mental health issues. Like, I have really dealt with depression and anxiety, and more specifically PTSD from medical trauma. So, like, things that go wrong that didn't have to go wrong, and nobody's listening to, and all of a sudden you're in a lot of danger. And those situations are really traumatic, and they do have lasting mental health implications. Or you can just independently, like, be a person with depression and have a there's nothing saying they're mutually exclusive. I agree. I think maybe this generation is a little more tuned into mental health issues generally. So I would hope that that'll be something that continues to change. But what you're describing to me is the hugest problem in the world of medicine or caring professions is that really, really way too often people with disabilities are not asked what they want. Like like, did you want to go through I mean, I don't know, like, I feel really, really lucky that my parents didn't feel comfortable signing me up for surgeries as a little kid, because that's something that often happens with people with my disability, brittle bones disease, is that you end up having a lot of operations to straighten your leg so you can walk, and my parents were like, "I don't feel comfortable choosing that life for her, she's gonna have to decide that for herself," and eventually I decided not to, because it was like, "I'm fine, I don't walking is not gonna make me a happier person," you know what I mean? And just listening to what disabled people say and then actually implementing it, like, I think this shift is slowly happening where there's more, I've been asked a lot, and it's not something I often do, to be totally off to be totally honest, is I don't often, like, do subject groups where you're a patient and you're talking to doctors, because I have other professional things I'm doing, and it's often unpaid and it's pretty time intensive, and like, but I respect that they are trying to get disabled people to talk to people who are training to be doctors and stuff.
Mm.
But there's still a disconnect in, like, that they're the expert and you're not the expert of your own body, and until that changes, and the biggest thing I think that needs to change, sorry, you hit a nerve apparently, is that I think the biggest thing for me that needs to change is people need to understand that the medical industry, by and large, does psychological harm to the disability community. Not because they're trying to, but because a lot of times they're not listening to what we're saying. And so when we start to accept that that's the norm, not the, I'll say, oh, this really bad thing happened to me, to, someone in the medical field, and they'll be like, "Oh, yeah, but that's the exception." Yeah, that's unfortunate. Sometimes that happened. And it's like, no, every person I know, literally every person I know with a disability has been, obviously simultaneously helped. Like, I'm not going to pretend that medical treatment hasn't been really important to my well-being, because it obviously has. But there are instances of not being asked, what do you want, or not being asked, like, how do you feel, or like, do you have any questions, just all the things that could be making that better. And I think the medical industry is probably hard, I'm sure it's hard to take in the truth that sometimes your desire to help ends up being harmful, and like, how can we correct that imbalance of power? um, I think if you had more disabled doctors or physical therapists
Mm.
or mental health workers or whatever it is, that would start to correct itself. Yeah, but the thing you're saying, like, "Hey, are you okay?" I think a non-disabled doctor is going to think about, well, Joel's desire is to walk, and it's like, maybe it's not. Maybe his desire is like, "Hey, I've been kind of depressed lately. Can you can you help me with that?" The things that I wish I didn't deal with so often were like anxiety, rather than
Mm.
ever having been like, "Oh, I wish I could walk." So that's a really long answer, but I agree with you that, like, mental health is a part of disability, and often it's, this, whether or not it's because of the medical industry or just because society is inaccessible, but mental health does often pair with other disabilities. That's why I believe in a really, sorry, one last thing is, the other thing that happened during the pandemic is I helped to co-found a group called Recording Artists and Music Professionals with Disabilities. It's, the acronym is RAMPD, RAMPD.org. And our big goal is to really widen the tent for disabilities. So if you identify as someone with mental health issues, then you can join. And you're disabled. I don't know. People don't necessarily have to identify themselves with that word at all moments, but recognizing that there is a connection to, like, mental health or neurodivergence or disability, and that we all benefit if we can get together rather than being siloed as separate issues, because we're
Yeah.
not. It's not separate.
Well, I mean, one of the wonderful benefits is, this is an example of it. Technology's enabled
Hmm.
community building that, I mean, we're kind of roughly this. I mean, I think I've got 5 years on here, but or 5 or 6. But I mean, we kind of grew up in the same generation where there was nothing, when
Yeah.
we were growing up, and it's like, who do we talk to? Who do we, you
Yeah.
know, who kind of gets it?
Hmm.
And you're going through your teen years and your body's changing anyway, and your body's already different, and it's getting really different. Now, who do you
Yeah.
talk to? You kind of have to figure it out. And in a way, I'm personally kind of happy I figured it out. And I too refused surgeries to
Okay.
um, correct the situation. I just realized I was born this way, and that's kind of how it is, you know.
Yeah.
And I was cool with it. But back then, I didn't know who to talk to, and
Hmm.
I'm glad I got through it on my own. But it would have been cooler, had we been able as teens, to
Hmm.
have a conversation like this. How are you getting on with it? Like, are you all right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I
I,
think,
I uh, spoke at a conference in 2018 for my disability. Osteogenesis Imperfecta Foundation has a conference, and I was a keynote one year, and they asked me to go to the youth room and talk to the kids, and I was just like blown away at how different it was for that generation to have. I mean, they all had like cool little inserts in their wheelchair wheels, and they all just had a lot of. I mean, it's not like I wasn't a confident kid, but I wouldn't have been confident around other disabled kids because I think on some level you're kind of like, oh, but I don't want to be seen as disabled. There was a little baggage. I think there was some baggage growing up about like you still wanted to be like quote unquote normal. And in many ways, I accepted myself, but it didn't take, I mean, I would say older, my college age, before I really was like 100% like, yes, I'm disabled and that's fine. You know what I mean? But these kids like have a head start because the mindsets are just different, and they have each other and they can talk to each other about what's going on. Where, like you, I was largely like, I was pretty separated from other disabled kids. And then not only that, I don't think I understood what it meant to have community. Like, it wasn't really encouraged for me to have a community with other disabled kids. I don't know. Yeah, there's ways to do it now that I think are changing for the better, probably.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and wonderful about your organization that you're involved in. That's fantastic. I'll be sure.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm glad.
I'll put the link up for that as well when I post the video. I wanted to, along these lines, I have another question for you. I did a video with an old bandmate of mine a couple days ago, and we were talking about how, for example, how wonderful it is when you tour and a venue has a shower, you know,
Yeah.
or like on-site laundry and how miraculous that is. I mean, those are nice creature comforts to have when you're touring, but touring is um, uh, an experience for you where you have other considerations when you're touring. Um, while you During those years you were touring 9 months out of the year and what have you, how would you describe the state of accessibility at venues in this country?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty pretty bad. I mean, I think when I started out, I didn't really get how messed up it was that things weren't accessible, that people were lifting up my chair, that Paul was bringing in our big wooden ramps from our van all the way into the venue, and like all the stuff that we did just to make it work. And the fact that I almost could never get to the green room.
Mm.
I mean, you're talking about creature comforts. I like did a show in New York City where my green room was the mop closet, literally. And so I asked them, can you at least remove the mop because it smells like bleach in here? Like it was not ideal. I mean, not all green rooms are nice anyways, but this was like particularly a low point. And so yeah, I think that venues that are older buildings, I think people have not held themselves to a standard as much as they should. Like, I understand that some renovations are big and maybe require some capital, but a lot of things aren't. It's just a lack of like building a plywood ramp should not take 35 years. You know what I mean? Like, it just shouldn't. Like, at this point, if you're a business owner and you pay your taxes and you manage to pay your employees, like, you should be able to figure out a way to add in some modifications. And if you can't do it financially on your own, then do some creative fundraising. Like it has to be more of a priority than a like, oh, if I win the lottery, then I'll make my venue accessible. You know what I mean? It's just not being prioritized. I did start in 2018, I think it was, refusing to play. And I mean, refusing to play isn't the right word. I would not book a show at a venue that wasn't accessible. And it wasn't necessarily about ADA accessibility at the time. It was more like, can people with disabilities get in the door? Can they get to the stage area? And can they use the bathroom? Because if you can't do those three things, and I think if there was a bar, like, can they get to the bar area? Like, those were like kind of the things that I cared about. And then for myself, if they didn't have a ramp to the stage, I would insist on playing on the floor instead of having people lift up my chair, because it's very dangerous, and it allows them to keep kicking the can down the road when
Right.
it's embarrassing for them, like, oh, she's on the floor, because we're obviously not doing our part of the bargain. It inspired quite a few venues, built me ramps, which I'm like, okay, cool. If you build the ramp, I will come, because I want to be supportive of people actually doing the work. So I had a lot of good examples, especially towards the end. But part of the change didn't happen until I changed my own standards, and I encourage not just disabled artists, but all artists to make a standard that you won't play a show that is discriminatory towards disabled people. I mean, really, if you play at venues that aren't accessible, I'm sorry to say that, like, in this time, 2024, I consider that like discrimination of omission. Like, you aren't doing your job to make your show as welcoming or even feasible or safe for people with disabilities. And so I think it's important that not just disabled artists take that stance, but that mainstream or like non-disabled, and especially some big artists. um, I have a friend from Duluth that's in a pretty well-known band, not Alan Sparhawk, somebody else, and he was saying, our last tour, I don't think you could have played in any of the venues, like, at all. And I
Mm.
was like, wouldn't it be great if you guys just played accessible venues, because you're a much bigger band than me, you draw a lot more people. Wouldn't it be cool if you like helped make that change? And he just didn't feel he felt like it would be like counterintuitive to their business practice, which I understand, but like eventually we do have to take a stand, and like it would be great if more artists took that temporary sacrifice in order to move the issue forward faster.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I
Yeah.
agree. I agree 100%.
Because it has impact, I mean, you educate a venue, and the good venues, the one that deserve to be open, do make the changes. They take it seriously, and those are the places that you want to promote anyways, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, here's to wishing the future gets brighter in that way.
Yeah, yeah, I
Uh,
agree. Yeah.
Before I know you have another commitment coming up in a bit, but before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, because there were times I was looking at your social media, and you're with Michael Stipe, the Michael Stipe, one of my favorite singers of all time, and you and Michael ended up connecting a bit and doing some things together. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, we did. Yeah, that was weird. I got an email from someone, I didn't recognize, and it was like, "Hey, wondering if you could sing some backup vocals on a track for Michael Stipe." And I was like, "What? That cannot be real." And I wrote back though, and I was like, "Yes, of course I would love to do that. Like, who do I talk to, or what? Like, what's the next steps?" And they were like, "Oh, I am Michael, and so let's talk about it." So I was like, "What?" So he obviously does not just have Michael Stipe at gmail.com. That is not his email address. So I was really surprised, but I was like still not sure until like many weeks later if it really was him. And then finally, like, I heard his voice and I was like, okay, yeah, that is him. But I recorded it in Duluth the first time and then just emailed it. So we didn't meet for a long time. And then when I was out in New York to do that show, the Broadway show, for the rehearsals, he said, let me know next time you come to New York. So I did. I told him, hey, we're here. And so he said, I was thinking, and what if we re-record your vocals, but I'm there, and like you should re-record them with me in the room so I can kind of coach you. He's like, they're good, but I have some ideas of how to change them up or whatever. And I was like, sure. So we found a time during the last week of rehearsals. It was a very stressful week, to like go to the recording studio and record with him. And it was so surreal and really cool to record with someone who's obviously that musically gifted. Like, I mean, I can't, it was just such a cool experience to be, his suggestions were so spot on, and his, like, he was so like, happy to be recording, and it was just really fun. Like, and he's a really nice person. So we ended up walking to like we got like a beer at like it was still COVID. Well, it's still COVID now, but like, we had a beer afterwards at a little cafe that had a big open window. We sat by the window and you know what I mean? Like, and just got to know him a little bit. And I mean, I consider him a friend now, I think. But like, I mean, I do. I think it's mutual. Like, he's very nice. He got to come to opening night for Macbeth, which was really sweet. And my parents got to meet him, and that was pretty fun. But I mean, yeah, I mean, his music was a big part of my family's musical repertoire. So it was neat. I was most excited to call my brother Ben when that happened, because he was born in 1978, and he was completely obsessed with R.E.M. growing up, and he was just like, he was over the moon. It was really cute. He's like, what? It was very fun. So yeah, but he's great, and hopefully we'll get to see him again someday. Who knows?
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. That's one thing I would tell anybody who's younger, who has a disability. It's worth sticking around just to find out what's going to happen, because you certainly didn't expect that email. You
No, and
know,
you didn't either with Pigface, I'm sure. I mean, I think that's a big thing. I was reading about, I've been reading more disability, like, literature, like people writing books, and just because I'm realizing that our stories are pretty underrepresented, and I think like there's this assumption that your life is gonna suck if you have
yeah,
a disability, and I'm like, it's just it doesn't it does not have to be true. I mean, especially if you have supportive people in your life, or you find supportive people, and I mean, I know that there are times that are really hard. I mean, even for you and me, I mean, overall I've had a really great life, but there are dark times. But still, it does not preclude you from having a really fun and interesting life. It just doesn't. Like, so many of the disabled people I know have done such fun, interesting, cool things, and I just think there's a disconnect in the way society sees us and assumes our lives must be like versus what they actually are like. And I don't know, it's rough, and I think people got to let that go in order to get behind like supporting us in the ways that really count, like accessibility and legislation and all the stuff that we need to have that support, get involved. So yeah,
yeah,
yeah, stick around. That's a good way to put it, though. You
yeah.
never know what's coming.
You never know. And when I woke up 2 weeks ago, I didn't know we'd be having this conversation, for example.
Yeah,
It's
agreed.
the ride is what makes it fun, and
Mhm.
you just really just have to have genuine fun and connect
Mhm.
with people you like and who bring you joy and vice versa.
Mhm.
The rest
Yeah.
of the rest of it can be put aside, have fun, stay positive, and you'll be amazed how far things go.
Uh-huh. And not trying to grasp. One thing that's been kind of fun with my music career is it's taken all these wild turns, but I really try not to like say, "Oh, I'll be happy with my music when this happens," or like if my shows get this big. I mean, I have like an imaginary idea of like, wouldn't it be cool if my tours weren't sometimes five people in the audience? You know what I mean? Like, everybody has, but honestly, if you get too focused on that, like comparing yourself to other artists, or setting concrete goals, you kind of like, I think, stress yourself out, where like there's really you can't control how things unfold 100%. So just enjoy the ride, you know what I mean? Enjoy
Yeah.
what you're doing right now, because the grass is always greener, no matter how big you get or how far you go or whatever. Just enjoy what's happening right now.
And I've learned at 46 to if I ever find myself in situations where I think, this has all been for nothing, I'm in a
Hmm.
slump.
Yep, exactly.
The life sucks. It's not going to get any better. It does.
Yeah,
It's
it
like
does.
that. It's like that Charles Bukowski quote, which I'll probably mangle because I can't recall it exactly. But he says something like, you know, when you wake up in the morning and think I can't go on anymore, smile and remember all the times you felt that way before. It's
That's true. It's totally true. Yeah, and like what you've come through and kind of like you've earned your stripes, so just like know that you can do it and keep going. And I don't know. Yeah, life does take a lot of turns, but I think in general, just trying to focus on the positive. I remember that, after my surgery, the one that I wrote that song about, I ended up having heart palpitations for a long time. Like they were benign, but they were really uncomfortable. And I was just super anxious and I was in not a good headspace for months because it lasted a really long time. And I remember making myself do a gratitude journal every day because it's like statistically proven to help kind of keep things in perspective. And I'm glad that I did that because it really like it's not like suddenly I felt like, oh, I feel like $1 million, but it was important to like acknowledge the good stuff that was actually that day, even though overall I felt pretty crappy. Like just having an awareness that there are things to be grateful for. I think it kind of shapes your overall view of life in general, that it keeps you from going too far down the rabbit hole. You know what I mean? Even if we are circling it, like keeps you out of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, I do know you have some things coming up. I don't want to keep you any longer, but I thank you so much for connecting with me, Galen. This has been wonderful. I hope it doesn't take another 6 years for it to happen again.
I'm
Um,
sure it will.
and
Yeah.
it's just been it's always great talking to you. It's you're one of my favorite people, and
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so glad we met. I mean, it's what a small world it is, don't you think?
it really is, and gets smaller by the day. Though the older I get, the smaller the world becomes. All the
Yeah.
connections
Oh,
out there. Greta Brinkman said it best. She goes, if you stick around the music world long enough, you're going to know everybody. Um, and that's how it is.
that's
I'm enjoying the ride. I'm enjoying these conversations I've been having on this channel, some of whom are with some mutual friends from the family, so to speak. So hoping to
yeah.
keep that up. And I'm just so thrilled to find you doing so well and having such great things in the present and looking towards the future. We will have to do this again when the book comes out.
Oh yeah, I know. I'm about halfway through, so I'm writing and writing and writing, and then hopefully it'll come out in towards the end of 2025. Like it
Hmm.
takes about a year once you finish it to get a book out into the world. But in the meantime, I have that Substack. I've been writing kind of mostly about disability and the idea of creativity as like a strength of disability, like something that we bring to the table that I think is often not acknowledged enough. So I'll be doing stuff before the book comes out, but yeah, we'll keep in touch. And then when I do come out again
Yes.
and tour, it would be great to see you in person eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You
Yeah.
got it.
Oh,
Until that happens, much love to you as always. Please give my best to Paul, and we will cross paths again. I'm sure of it.
I will. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Galen. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Bye.